Well, hey, welcome back to 316, a Bible study at Bridgeway Church in Tampa, Florida. My name is Joel Eason, and I serve as the senior pastor at Bridgeway. On behalf of our church, welcome to this study. I'm thrilled that you're there. If possibly you're new with us and don't know anything about Bridgeway, we'd love to have you check us out at www.bridgeway.tv. You can read up on more about us. But I'm thrilled that you're here for this study in 316. Now, I say this regularly. Here's why we call this 316. We're anchored in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, that we're reminded that all Scripture is God-breathed. It's useful for teaching and for rebuking, for correcting, for training in righteousness, so that we might be properly equipped for all that God has called us to do. And I hope that this study is a benefit to you, and I want you to know that I'm honored that you're with us. Now, we're going through the book of Matthew, and this is the fourth part or fourth installment of our study so far. And I'll flip over and show you just real briefly so far where we've been. We started off in our first time together talking about the introduction, the genealogy, making sense of why that's there, and we'd love to have you listen to that if you missed it. The childhood of Jesus. We talked in the second time about his baptism, about the temptation in the desert, and then he begins calling disciples. And then our last installment, we dealt with the first part of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. Where we are in this study is the second part of chapter 5, and then we'll finish out the Sermon on the Mount next week with chapter 6 and 7. And you can kind of see what is on the lineup. The study of Matthew will take us all the way to Easter. If you're watching this in 2024, it'll take us to Easter of 2024. If you're watching it later, then hopefully that'll make sense as to why we've arranged the particular weeks in the fashion that we have. Now, I established this last week. I won't go into a lot of the detail around Galilee and where exactly he's talking from. If you missed last week's, we'd love to have you look at that. I dealt with two locations that the Sermon on the Mount historically is said to have come from. They're both on the same hill, basically. You just have a lower and a higher location, and I gave you photos from being in Galilee, photos that I took from there, and I'd love to have you check those out. But we said for the Sermon on the Mount from chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus says this, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you'll certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." And so you have a real central theme here, an overall message. And so if I push off of that, for Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, you have this overall message as to what is true righteousness. What does it really look like to follow the Lord? What does discipleship look like? What's the character of a person following the Lord? And you would have had in a time where people held on to, we'll call it behavioral piety, my behavioral righteousness. If I do the right things and avoid the wrong things, then I'm righteous. And Jesus is going to push in the Sermon on the Mount that it's actually a little more complicated and deeper than that, and that righteousness doesn't begin with behavior, and I'm going to say hand. Behavior starts internally with the heart, and if you have heart righteousness, then you'll also have it evidenced in how you live. But just having hand behavioral righteousness does not mean that your heart is right with God. And so the context of the Sermon on the Mount is really driving into the heart of the matter, the heart of a person, and do you follow the Lord from down inside? So that's why he's going to say regularly, you have heard it said, and he'll push on a teaching from the law, which will talk about behavioral piety, and he'll say, but I say unto you, and he'll push it even deeper down into the heart for an examination in your heart. And we're going to see that very clearly, I think, in this study. Now, one thing that I want to just highlight is what's going to follow the front part of the Beatitudes. He's going to do a teaching on the Beatitudes, blessed are you, and we talked about the Latin word for beatus is where we get blessed, and that's where we get Beatitudes from beatus. But the Greek was makarios, and it literally meant happy or content, this centered place. And if you haven't already, I highlighted this last week, but the book Cost of Discipleship from Dietrich Bonhoeffer is really a classic. And he deals with, in the front section, he deals with grace. He deals with the grace of the Lord and what it means to be a disciple. So this discipleship and grace, and if you don't have discipleship that follows grace, he defines it as a cheap grace. And what is the cost of giving your life to the Lord? And then from that front section, Dietrich Bonhoeffer goes into the Sermon on the Mount, leaning on the aspects of the Sermon on the Mount. If you want to take the study of Sermon on the Mount even further, I highly encourage you to get that book. It'll be of great benefit to you and your library. But we'll see that following what we discussed last week, this section on the Beatitudes, that he is going to lean into what is commonly identified by theologians and scholars as these 6 antitheses, where he's going to take 6 commands from the law, and these would have been prominent in their culture, and he's going to lean on them, not from the hand, but down in the heart. And he's going to deal with murder, adultery, divorce, oaths, an eye for an eye, which would be retaliation, or justice, and then he's going to push on love for enemies. So that's what we're going to lean on in this study, and then in our next time together, we'll deal with chapter 6 through 7. Now, before I go from this, let me just kind of give you a parallel to consider. If you're a parent, and you tell your kids you're leaving them for a second, you're going to the store, you're leaving them for the day, or you're leaving them with grandparents, and as a parent you tell them, hey, don't fight with one another. Like, technically what you're saying is behavioral. Don't put fist to fist, don't bite one another, don't kick one another, don't be in conflict. That's behavioral. As a parent, you hope that that statement also is to take care of your sibling, like an inner heart to be nice towards your sibling. It's not just don't be in fist fights, but have a better disposition towards your kid than just conflict, right? So we understand as parents the idea that we give instructions, but we hope that it goes deeper. That's what Jesus is pushing on. He's going to push on the instruction and try and drive it deeper into the heart for people. So we're going to look at these 6 ones, and so he deals with murder first. And this is coming from Exodus chapter 20, verse 13 would have been the commandment about thou shalt not murder, do not murder. And so in verse 21 of Matthew chapter 5, you have Jesus saying, you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. That was from the law. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now, let's kind of talk about that for a second, because most of us have heard that and said, and that seems extreme, that hell is in play with me calling somebody a fool. What is being depicted here? So Jesus is pointing to a pervasive problem, and he's going to give strong warning. And the pervasive problem was that the strong feelings of hate and anger that can arise towards one another. And in the context of murder was a legal matter. if there was murder, whether that be intentional or whether that be self-defense, you can go all the way back to the Old Testament law, and you would have a process of justice that would come for anybody who committed that kind of atrocity or sin or infraction. And Jesus is saying that behavioral to the hand, there's a process. But we can feel that I can hate somebody on the inside of my heart and feel no penalty. Like I can have hate towards somebody or anger towards somebody, and there is no response, no recourse. I'm not judged by that. I'm not accountable to God even for that. And Jesus is going to say that righteousness is not a hand matter, it's a heart matter. And if you have this progression going from anger to raka to fool, then something is off, something is in danger of judgment in your heart. So let's talk about that. So you have this progression from anger. We've all been angry at somebody, and we've all let anger stew in our heart, and we've all kind of had that burning inside, even if we don't vocalize it and even if we don't act upon it to somebody. Raka was a term for empty-headed. We would use the term idiot. So let's say, for instance, somebody makes you angry while you're driving and you say, "You idiot." It's under your breath. You say it in your heart. If you're in a car, maybe you vocalize it out loud. Maybe at home, a spouse or a kid or a parent or somebody in the family does something that angers you, and under your breath you call them an idiot. That would be what raka is. It's this under the breath stewing where I don't just have a feeling, but it has an expression now, but not everybody can see it, hear it, know it. It's not identifiable. Jesus, when he connects that to the Sanhedrin, he's saying you're in danger. Anger is finding expression. Hatred is going to find an expression. And when you come to this, you fool, that's a public shaming. That's a public disgracing. So there's this progression of anger to you idiot to a public declaration. It is built and grown in your heart. So something to consider with you fool, and you can look into this yourself. There was a phrase in Jewish culture called Lashon Hara. So if you want to write that down, it would be Lashon, second word Hara, Lashon Hara. And it would be to like gossip. It would be it was a concept of to steal the face of somebody, to make them pale, to take away their face. It would be the idea if you were to judge somebody and strip them of their reputation, it was as equal to murder of them. Lashon Hara. So you have you fool is a public removing of their face, so to say. You're publicly shaming or judging. And Jesus is pointing to the reality that that whole spectrum from anger in the heart to you idiot to actually a public outcry, it all comes from this connectedness to murder. You're guilty when you have an unresolved element of that. And you think about that progression before we go any further of Cain. The first time we see murder in the scripture happens from Adam and Eve's kids. Cain kills Abel, and he has this inner seeing that his offering to the Lord is not appreciated the way that Abel's is, and he has this building to the point that he murders. And Jesus is saying if your righteousness thinks that you can cover up inner hate and inner you idiot, and to the point that you try and shame somebody, that whole dynamic is great warning. And so in that, he then says, therefore, if you have an offering, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. So this front part, he's talking about a brother. And then the second part, you're going to see he deals with an adversary. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court. Do it while you're still with him on the way. Or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. I tell you the truth, you'll not get out until you've paid the last penny. So that was very common to the culture. If somebody owed you, you could bring them to a judge, and they could sentence them to be in prison until payment could be made. That was very common for them. I would just highlight that Jesus raises a brother and an adversary. And you can have hate building or anger building. You can be at the point that under your breath you're calling brother or adversary idiot, and it's stewing in you. And I think we all can understand and identify what it feels like to have unspoken or unacted upon anger in our heart towards somebody. And Jesus gives strong warning about that, whether it be brother or adversary. Whether it happened to you or you did it to them, he says, your righteousness needs to surpass that of the Pharisees, who would have just said, as long as you don't do the act of murder, you're good. You can have whatever going on in your heart. And Jesus says, no, the person that follows the Lord has an inner heart purity. And so the first thing that he dealt with was murder. The second thing that he's going to deal with in the heart is adultery. So he says, you've heard that it was said, do not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, let me lean on something there real quick. Actually, let me go ahead and read the second portion. So we'll come back to that. He's addressing men per se, but I have a thought or something to say about that. He says, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. So let's lean on that. So he's addressing men only because, that's not to say that this can't be flipped, and not to say that women can't also lust, and that it's only a man issue. It might be more predominant for men, but that's not to say that it's not solely a man issue. Jesus is speaking in a cultural time period of history where all things were dealt with the men. He's talking to the men because that's the custom of the day. If you were teaching a principle, you taught it to men. If you were teaching a principle of life and judgment and fairness and faithfulness in any of the regard, you'd teach it to men. So that's very common. He is not letting women off the hook, so to say. But here's what I want you to understand. For that time period, for that age, and I think you could make a strong case to this day, adultery was seen as theft. That's important. Adultery was a sin of theft. To take something that was not yours. You stole something from someone and it was not yours to have. God never gave it to you and it was not yours to have. And so there's a great warning about in the heart. So let's talk about that, because you could say, well, I didn't commit the act of adultery. I didn't commit the act of thieving, of stealing a spouse or stealing somebody's intimacy. I didn't do it, but I have it in my heart. And Jesus says, if you have had it down in your heart, if you've lusted down in your heart, if you've let your mind play out, then you've allowed yourself to contemplate that theft. And Jesus is saying it's before God as though you've done it. He is not saying that the thought and the action are equal. That's not what he's depicting. The thought doesn't break up a family. The act breaks up a family. He's saying there's still an accountability before God, that if you have it in your heart, have it in your mind, you linger on that, you're allowing a theft, and before God, it's sin. And sometimes in our culture, we can say, well, I'm not hurting anybody. Okay, well, by the action, by the hand, maybe not, but in the heart, Jesus is saying you're creating theft and it will have ramifications. And I think we all could look at the statistics of how lust and even pornography so jeopardizes families, so jeopardizes young people, so jeopardizes older people. It jeopardizes and breaks so many things apart, and we would say it totally has an impact. I think it comes down to this component where when you have theft happening in the heart, the tendency is to look at and reach for. So Jesus says, if your eye's causing you to thieve and to take, you would gouge your eye out. If your hand is reaching to grab, you would cut your hand off. Now, some people have taken this literal in church history. There's a real famous church father of ages back called Origen, and he literally castrated himself according to this passage so that he would not sin in that regard. I think we all know that you could dismember yourself and still have sin in the heart. Jesus is not talking about a dismemberment. He's talking about the significance of not grabbing for what is not yours. And so adultery is a heart issue, not a hand issue. And Jesus is saying, that God has strong things to say about that. So if we keep going, then you go to the third one, and that would be divorce, coming from Deuteronomy chapter 24. And we'll just read it. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress, and anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery. Now, I'm going to lean more heavy on this when we get to Matthew 19, because Jesus has more significant things to say pertaining to marriage and divorce. But one of the things that the Pharisees will try and tempt Jesus in Matthew 19, is that Moses commanded us in this certificate of divorce. No, he didn't command, and it's coming from Deuteronomy 24. It was an allowance. But let me read what Deuteronomy 24 says. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and then it goes on to talk about what happens. So let's lean on that. So in Jewish culture, you had two different schools of prominent thought, Hillel and Shammai. And one is more liberal, one is more, conservative. And you could say, well, which one was more popular? I think you could probably do the math that the liberal had more proponents for. And so in one regard, there was what is displeasing? It had to be moral impurity. It had to be some form of sinful action. And or the other side, on the more liberal side of school of thought, was literally, you can read commentaries about this, that if a woman did something so much as to our equivalent of burning the toast, that you could divorce. Well, anything that gets that free is entirely an error. And so what was being suggested was that as long as you offered a certificate of divorce, then you had an out for whatever. That looks a lot like our culture today. That you want out, you get out. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's not what Jesus is condoning whatsoever, but that was never on the table with God. So we're going to talk a little more about that in Matthew 19 when he gets into it. What is being pushed on in this regard is that Jesus is highlighting not the hand, but the scenario of the heart. In my opinion, because it's keeping in step with what he's dealt with murder, what he has dealt with adultery. What comes next is oaths and vows. What would you have in the marriage or the family context? You would have vows, and you would have what should be fidelity. And there in the middle is this statement about divorce, in the middle of what should have been fidelity and vows. And so he is not going to he's not going to keep it as a hand issue. He keeps it as a heart issue. Hope that makes sense. Because what comes next then is number 4 is oaths. And he's pushing off of Leviticus 19. Again, you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you've made to the Lord. I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it's God's throne, or by the earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. I'll go ahead and look at the next verse, and then I'll have some comments about that. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, your no be no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. So let's talk about that. So in some Jewish communities, there was a tendency to swing very, very big. And what do I mean by that? Have you ever watched somebody who tries to promise you something and they overpromise, they swing too big? For people that would swing so big as say, I promise or I vow by Jerusalem. Well, let's lean on this. They dare not do it according to God's name, because that would be a breaking of the commandment. Thou shalt not do anything to the name of God. You shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. Early commandment, right? Well, so they wouldn't touch the name of God, so they would grab heaven or they would grab Jerusalem. They would swear by Jerusalem or they would swear by heaven. Let's think about our culture. How many times have you heard somebody, and maybe you've done it yourself, I swear to God, or if God is my witness, and what are we doing? We're trying to make a statement, and we're trying to get the verification of the divine on our side. That God stands with us, that we're telling the truth. And Jesus says, don't you dare touch that, because none of that belongs to you. Well, Jewish communities swung either of to validate their vow by a name or something greater than them. To other Jewish communities swung to the other side and not vowing anything. There were Jewish communities in Jesus' day that would not vow to anything so as to not defile, because they felt like everything belongs to the Lord. I mean, that's what we read about in the book of Psalm, that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So to swear by anything is to try and swear by his name, so they wouldn't make a vow of anything. And what Jesus is pushing on is the credibility of your word. Now let's lean on that, because that's a hard issue. Have you ever had a contract? You signed a contract for your cable bill, signed a contract for your phone bill, signed a contract for insurance, signed a contract for something, and there was fine print. You didn't read the fine print because it would take forever. You just signed it, only to find out that the fine print was damaging to you. I'm one of those guys that if I have something to sign, I sign it. I don't read it. I just assume that it's in my best interest. My father-in-law, who's since passed and with the Lord in heaven, he had this phrase that he would tell me early days of the church, and man, it has helped us so much. He said, the contract speaks for itself. And the contract is always written in favor of the one writing the contract. There's fine print that favors the one who wrote it, even though you're signing it. It is not there to protect you. It's there to protect the one who wrote it. I think we've all been on the contract side where we signed something and there's fine print embedded that worked against us, penalty that worked against us. Well, Jesus is depicting here to be a person of integrity on the inside of our heart, not to swing big by swearing according to God and God is my witness and I swear to God and all those kinds of things. He would say that's sin. None of that is yours to swear by. And then we're also not on the side that we bait people and we hide things on people. Let your yes be an integrous yes. Let your no be an integrous no. Righteousness is on the inside of the heart. And remember what he was saying. Your righteousness has to surpass the Pharisees. The Pharisees were hand behavioral piety, but could be dark in the heart because God doesn't look there. And Jesus is saying God absolutely looks in the heart. So we keep going here, and he deals with eye for eye, which is a retaliation that's coming from Leviticus 24. You've heard that it was said eye for eye, tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. And I'm going to lean on that for a second. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, he's going to give three parallels. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, this is important because this is a hard matter. The measures of justice that were in place were good things. Anytime you have justice in place, it's a good thing. It's a healthy thing. Jesus is not speaking against justice. He is not highlighting, let's have more injustice. He is not degrading a person that stands up for themselves and needs to defend themselves. But I think we all know that kind of eye for eye, tooth for tooth living. We've probably watched somebody who is, don't mess with me, then you'll be fine. Mess with me, you're going to get some. That's a real dangerous way to live, and it's not a righteousness of the heart. The righteousness of the heart is willing to stand in some things. So let me lean on something. He says, if somebody strikes you on the right cheek, turn to them the other as well. Jesus is not at all in any regard condoning abuse. Jesus is not in any regard saying, if you're being abused, stay in the abuse. You're bound to the abuse. That's not what he's depicting. He is depicting you still don't run from some things. If somebody strikes you, the only way for them to strike the other cheek is for you to remain where you are, to keep standing even when things are difficult. You're not a runner. You're not a runner, and you're not one that is prone to looking for the fight. There's an inner integrity that you're willing to stand even when things are afflicting at times. So if somebody tries to take more than they have right to, you're not always fighting them in that. So Paul will say to the Corinthian church on one accord, he'll say, why not rather be cheated? He's talking about in the church there was lawsuits happening, and he uses that line, why not rather be cheated? It's the idea, I don't need everything, I don't need 4 to equal 4. I don't have to always be even. To always be even is a hand matter. For the allowance for there to be some inequity, that's a hard issue. For this one that you have, if one causes you to go 1 mile and the Roman soldier could force somebody to walk a mile, he's saying you're willing to go more. You're willing to give more. That's a hard matter. He is not highlighting and raising abuse. He is not downgrading justice. What he is saying is the person of righteousness that's on the hand is only looking for eye. He's looking like, you don't get none, you don't take none from me, won't take none from you. Heart matter is like, God, it's in your hands. I'll leave things in your hands. I'm not going to make everything equitable according to my will. And that takes us then to the next step. This is a progression, as you can see, of from murder to adultery, of taking something not yours, to divorce, to oaths, to eye for eye. Now here we are at love enemies. And he says this is reaching to Leviticus 19. And this is where in Leviticus 19 where we get the passage about love your neighbor. You've heard that it was love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. One more verse. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing this? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do this? So you have this scenario in which Jesus has been talking about Beatitudes, to be salt and light. You're the light of the world. You're the salt of the earth. He had said to them about murder, and then adultery, divorce, oaths, eye for eye. Now he's at love. And how do you love? How do you love in the heart, not just at the hand level, but in the heart level when it's against you? Now I'm going to ask you to do something, and you're just going to have to kind of, play along with me, if you will. Let's for a moment contemplate, and I'm going to go back one. Contemplate this statement about love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Can I just ask you to push pause on you and push pause on me and push pause on how do we live that out? And can we think for a second about Matthew, who is writing it? If you'll remember, Matthew is writing from Antioch. Okay, so if we were to go, if we were to look at the map, you remember, and we did this in the first couple of talks. Jerusalem is far south, and then it comes up north to Judea, and then comes up to Samaria, and then even beyond that north is Damascus, and even beyond that north is Antioch. So let me read a couple passages. I'm going to read from Acts chapter 9, verse 1 and 2, and then I'll read a passage in verse 11. So in Acts chapter 7, there's this stoning of Stephen, the persecution of the church, and we're going to see in chapter 8 that the church starts moving, the church starts fleeing. In Acts chapter 9, meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, being Jesus, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. So follow me. Acts chapter 9, Paul wants to go north to Damascus, towards Antioch, where the church had moved. This is a good long distance away. He has to go from Jerusalem up through Judea, up through Samaria, past the Sea of Galilee, up into present-day Syria, past Damascus, up towards Antioch. In Damascus, he has this famous encounter with the Lord. But if I jump ahead to Acts chapter 11, verse 19, listen to this one verse. Now those who had been scattered by the persecution in connection with Stephen, that's Acts chapter 7, traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, which was the island off in the Mediterranean, and Antioch, telling the message only to Jews. Did you hear that? Let me read it again. That they had traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, telling the message only to Jews. I said to you in our first two lessons that Matthew was written specifically to Jewish people, to the Jewish reader. Now, of course, it was broadcast to Gentiles, but his initial focus was to Jewish readers. He's in Antioch. They are there from fleeing from the persecution that was coming their way. So I want you to keep that in mind, if you will, as you look back at this verse. The first audience that heard this were in Antioch, and they were there because they had been pushed out of Jewish territories, and they had persecution endangering them, coming for them. And Matthew says, love your neighbor, hate your enemies, what you've heard. But remember, Jesus told us, but I tell you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. So what am I leaning on? I'm leaning on one, Jesus' teaching when it happened at the Sea of Galilee, Sermon on the Mount. I'm also pushing on when Matthew wrote it, which was, as we've talked about, somewhere between 55-65 AD. And he is writing, and the first audience are people who absolutely knew what persecution was, who were in Antioch because of the persecution. To me, I find that to be really, really strong, and it makes me remember that in your life and my life, righteousness is not a hand issue, it's a heart issue. And so you've had this whole progression from the Beatitudes to this point. And he says, chapter 5 is going to finish with this: be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And the Greek word that you have here is teleos, and teleos would be complete, mature. And, sometimes when we hear be perfect, it's like, well, how could I be perfect? Because I'm not perfect. But remember some different contexts where you'll find perfect. For instance, James chapter 1, perseverance must finish, that's teleos, its work, so that you may be mature, teleos, and complete, not lacking anything. So Jesus is not depicting you're going to be sinless. Your Father is sinless, but you let the sinless one, him, allow for the maturing in your life. Remember, your righteousness has to surpass that of the Pharisees, which just thought, as long as I don't sin behavioral with my hands, then I can think and feel whatever I want. Jesus says, no, righteousness is down inside of here. And so don't let these things build in here. Understand the necessity of allowing the Lord to transform you so that you might be mature, complete, like the Father. And with that, then he goes into chapter 6. I'll show you what chapter 6 and chapter 7 look like. We're going to touch on all these all in one talk. He's going to talk about giving to the needy. This is the famous where he says, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. He's going to talk about prayer, the famous Lord's Prayer. He's going to talk about fasting and making sure that you don't display to everybody you're fasting. He'll talk about treasure in heaven, where store up for yourselves treasure in heaven where moth and rust aren't working against your treasure. And don't worry, this is where he's going to give the famous line, chapter 6, verse 33. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. Chapter 7, judging others. This is where the famous visual of, how can you try and take that speck out of your brother's eye when you've got a plank in your eye? The ask, seek, knock. That's where he's going to say, how many of you who are parents, if your kid asked, he asked for a fish, you'd give him a snake instead. Or if he asked for bread, you'd give him a rock instead. The narrow and wide gate, one leads to life, one leads to death. Many travel the wide road, but it leads to death. Very few travel the narrow road, but it leads to life. The tree and fruit, this is where in Matthew chapter 7 you're going to have the famous, not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom of God. And we'll talk about what that meant. What was he leaning on? And then he finishes the Sermon on the Mount with the famous visual of the one who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice, like a man who built his house upon a rock. Rains came, storm came. It blew, but he was fine. The person that did not apply his life to these words, rains came, storm blew in, and his house had a great crash. And so that's what we're going to be looking on. Very famous set of teaching from chapter 6 and chapter 7. And I hope you will be able to join me as we continue in the Sermon on the Mount and in our study of the book of Matthew. I hope this has been a blessing to you. I hope you've maybe either learned something, been reminded of something, or you'll take it and investigate it, study it even further. And I hope to see you again on the next one. God bless you.